to be an unspoken tradition for lead-off speakers at a communist university to complain about the titles they've been given. I don't think that one could really make that strong an argument for using Althusser directly as a guide for revolutionary practice for reasons which I hope will become obvious. However, that doesn't exhaust his usefulness to revolutionary practice, which is another matter entirely. So for that matter, a lot of this will be dry and, kind of theoretical rather than a barnstormer of a rally or anything like that. But it's good that they transcribed 1968 into it as well. That's a good feature of the title. Because in one sense, it's the one thing that absolutely everybody knows about Louis Althusser, is that in May 1968, violent struggles break out between students and police, and there's a mass general strike of 10 million workers, 2/3 of the federal workforce, I believe. And all the while, Louis Althusser is nowhere to be seen. Now, it's not uncommon for Louis Althusser to be nowhere to be seen because he has long-running battles with depression, particularly, and often kind of to the point of psychosis, and he's often hospitalised. By now, he'd already gone through, I think, 2 lots of electroconvulsive therapy. Another theory is that he was in Turley doing something with a robotic lion. That's another thing. Where are you, Linda? Perhaps Linda can explain it later. But that's another matter entirely. So then he turns up. The whole thing's wound up. De Gaulle reasserts power with the help of the PCF, of which Althusser is a member. The PCF says that there was never a revolutionary situation. It was there was no connection between the revolt of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia, quote unquote, and the revolt of the working class. This is all well known. And finally, in his first words on the subject, in August, I think, Althusser comes out with an article that basically backs the PCF line on it. This actually splits the small faction he has around himself, called like Spinoza, after a very influential philosopher, Emil's comrades. Jacques Rancière, who's one of the people who contributed to the original Reason Capital, abandons him, writes a big book about how it's, in fact, not just saying he was wrong to not come out and support this, but that it follows from various theoretical problems that happened before. This is the story everybody knows. He just chickens out or goes mad at the wrong time or something. There's another story which is more in the run-up to it, which is that in the communist, the UEC, the Communist Party student group, there is an ongoing factional struggle. There's a small group of Trotskyists involved somehow. I'm not sure exactly what tendency they were from. But the main combatants are a group of Maoist-inclined students who are very radical, who, in the way of these things, got nicknamed the Chinese, and a group of proto-Euro-communist sort of kind of right-wing students who were following, because they were following Togliatti in Italy and others, they were called the Italians. So there's an ongoing struggle between the Chinese and the Italians. And Althusser is vastly influential on the Chinese, and he makes in around '66 he makes very, very close links with the Chinese. He even writes pseudonymously an essay which is fulsome in its praise of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, how this is finally the masses taking power, taking back the power from the party. You know, isn't this amazing? Isn't this wonderful? Which is a very common view among left-wing intellectuals at the time. But it's remarkable in the sense that if he'd done it under his own name, he would have immediately been expelled from the PCF because, like most of the communist parties around the world, it sided with the Soviet Union against Mao in the Sino-Soviet split, which is early in the 60s. It becomes obvious that although the Chinese strike a devil's bargain with people who were sympathetic to the official. To the party centre, Valdec Rocher, and I'll apologise in advance to any francophone people in the room for my butchery of pronunciation. They strike a devil's bargain with the centrists, so to speak, in order effectively to get the trots out of the UEC. But then almost immediately the centrists start manoeuvring against them. And it becomes obvious that they're going to have to split. And initially, Althusser goes along with the split. He says they should split. But eventually he loses the appetite for splitting off and effectively leaves them high and dry. And they effectively force him out. They try effectively to threaten him into going with them, but he stands firm. He buries himself ever further into the party, effectively, and actually loses a lot of the allies he had. Still, the theoretical mark that he's left on them is still there, and it only gets stronger. As his work changes, which we'll get to later. The last kind of story is that, despite the fact that he comes out with this ridiculous PCF line after the events, there is probably no philosopher of the Marxist movement who by that point had whose concepts actually seem to be quite so almost predestined to explain how it happened. And it's and that's that's the lasting important. That's the enduring legacy. That's what should be the enduring legacy. But it has gotten buried. So what is this theoretical legacy? The starting point for all of Althusser's investigations is what is the fucking point of being a Marxist, effectively? What's so special about Marx? His is a contribution effectively to that. You know, he's not the first person to ask it. Georgi Lukács famously posed it at the beginning of in an essay called "What is Orthodox Marxism?" And he answers it by saying it's the method. It's the method. Marxism is the dialectical method, and that's true, but insufficient in the sense that it doesn't tell us what this dialectical method is. So the tendency among the followers of Lukács has been to describe it as effectively the Hegelian method, but sort of flipped upside down. Instead of talking about how thought develops the world, it's the world that develops thought, and it's basically the same method that kind of almost picked up and plopped onto a new object in a way. The thing is this conflicts with another very, very common definition of the Marxist revolution in thought, which is that it's the combination of French utopian socialism, German philosophy, and English political economy. Of course, these are all scare quotes in a sense, but they were the centres of the various trends that came into it. The thing is, if you look at French utopian socialism and compare it to Marxian socialism, it's very obvious that we're talking about vastly different beasts. the utopians are people, or people like Saint-Simon, and if you read their utopias, it's, some of them are quite terrifying. Like they have laid out, I mean, he came up with Icaria or something else. Draper refers to it. Cabet. He's got he's written down what colour different clothes people are going to wear. And a lot of it is kind of based on sort of Spartan barrack room ethos, and you couldn't really get more different from a Marxist approach if you tried. There is no Marx utopia in that sense. No, he never sat down and wrote one of these massive tracts deciding on the colour of the ginger. It's just that. If we look at political economy, well, I mean, come on. It's Marxist political economy is a vastly different beast to even the classics, for which he had a great respect. So this leaves us a problem. We have utopian socialism has been completely, radically butchered and rearranged and all the rest of it. Political economy has been butchered and rearranged and all the rest of it, but somehow it's still necessary to affect. Philosophy is basically Hegel's logic. It just doesn't really wash. We have to. It seems just it's very counterintuitive to imagine that that's going to get through scot-free. So on the other hand, it's very difficult to deny the influence of the young Hegelian milieu. So the way Althusser tries to deal with this question is with the concept of the epistemological break. Now, this is picked up from a philosopher of science called Gaston Bachelard. He doesn't use it that much at all, actually, but it's simply the moment when a sort of assemblage of kind of practical knowledge about how things work, becomes a science. So it's kind of the moment when shit falls, becomes gravity. He uses this to explain how to posit the idea of a rupture, a total. In his early works, and that's the way to start. I'll be talking mostly about kind of early days. It's like a total. It's almost a clean break. You have the 1844 manuscripts, which are under the influence of Feuerbach. And then you have the rejection of Feuerbach and the foundation, in 1845, the foundation of Marxism as a science, historical materialism. The opening up of the continent of history to science. Engels, most of this sort of is based on a fabulous sequence of Engels' preface to the second volume of Capital, which describes the foundation of modern chemistry in terms of how first you have people who discover, they find oxygen, they produce it, but they don't call it oxygen. They still try and Shanghai oxygen into the old sort of theory. So they call it dephlogisticated air, which means air that stuff burns in really well. Basically, is what it comes down to. So the thing is, this is produced by Priestley and Sheila, chemists in Britain. They send off their results immediately to their kind of colleague Lavoisier, and Lavoisier looks at it and says, "No, this just doesn't work. This is going to happen." And he basically scraps the whole thing. He says, "All right, this you've produced this. I have discovered the science. This is now completely changed." So you have a complete progress from a practical knowledge to a scientific knowledge. So Althusser says, using the example of a section of Marx's critique of Adam Smith, Althusser says this is what's happening here. Adam Smith has all but found surplus value. He's identified the reproduction of labour power, but he doesn't say labour power. He only says labour. What Marx does is he restores the word power, and suddenly this breaks the horizon. There's just a single change means that everything else has to change. Here we get to what this change actually is, and particularly the problem for Althusser is that's the science. Okay, everyone kind of agrees on what the science is. What is Marx's philosophy? How is Marx's famous science through theory? There's a famous thing where basically every Althusserian, particularly in the late 60s, has to go, I am not an empiricist, I hereby renounce all empiricism, all historicism, and all humanism. Like, there are three cardinal sins, you're not allowed to do any of them. So what does this mean? Empiricism is traditionally understood, in this classical definition, as a branch of philosophy which comes from John Locke and Berkeley and Hume, which is it's a kind of it's this idea that the source of knowledge is sense data ultimately was the primary feature of it, and variations of it. You get massive systems coming out of it. Althusser actually massively extends the definition of empiricism in his early work. He decides that actually what this means is any philosophy that you have a given subject and a given object, and knowledge as a sort of abstraction of the essence of the object by the subject. That's a lot of jargon, to say the least. The idea that this is a glass of water, and there's an objective property of this glass of water, which is the knowledge that it is a glass of water. And what I do with my brain is I go in and dig it out, and then it goes into my brain, and then I know that it's a glass of water, and that's the process of it. That is the kind of technical definition that we're given. Now, the reason it's so radically extended, actually, is precisely to kind of Shanghai Hegel into it. Because then, even though the subject and the object is kind of posited as a unity, there's still that kind of you can still just about get him into it. He goes there's torturous sort of pages of Reading Capital where he proves that Hegel is an empiricist in this sort of definition. Historicism it's basically the view that historical moments kind of produce their own knowledge. Empiricism is a big sin, and all the rest of them are kind of variants of it. Historicism is that there's sort of an essence of the age, and kind of theories and ideology are sort of either more or less distorted sort of self-awareness of the historical moment. He identifies this with, particularly with Gramsci, and he leads a merry dance with Gramsci's whole life, really. This idea that he criticises it because what it means for him is effectively that everything gets sort of flattened out. You can no longer distinguish between the philosophy of history, dialectical materialism, and the science of history, historical materialism. It's all kind of collapsed into the sort of self-awareness of history in a sense. And obviously Hegel's sort of spectral figure there as well. The last is humanism. Now, humanism is it's a complicated beast, because what's really at issue here is humanism as theory, as the idea that the concepts of humanism have a theoretical value. Yeah, everyone goes through it. You'll have heard it 450 billion times this week. Marxism is a project of the universal liberation of humanity. Well, fine. Everyone goes around saying that. It's like a badge in a sense. It's kind of more colloquial. There's also kind of an ideological sense that it's put it as a sort of weapon kind of thing. you arm yourself with this ideology and you go out and you kind of, it's a way of affecting change in the world by arming yourself with it. Theoretical humanism is quite a different claim. It's a claim that the concepts that come out of it have value in terms of scientific meaning, that they can produce knowledge. So it's the idea that you put a particular a humanist concept, like alienation, in sort of one end of the machine, and at the other end you can discover things that are useful in terms of science. Althusser equivocates on using humanism as an ideology, but he is absolutely against using it as theory. For him, one of the fundamental gains of Marxism is sweeping away all the old crap, in that sense of humanism. The important things are the concepts of social class, of the class struggle, the mode of production, of the relations of production. These things are not humanist concepts. There's an overlap in which people kind of play. There is a tradition of Marxism that sort of brings alienation into things, but effectively what it has to do is completely retool it and give a name, give a kind of humanist name to a concept which has already been kind of ripped out of that problematic. And that's a kind of contradiction I identify a lot. Now that's all very, very boring. That's all very kind of dry. And the thing you have to understand is that all this is actually an intervention in the politics of the PCF. Fundamentally, after 1956, with Khrushchev's secret speech, the PCF has basically lagged behind radically in terms of de-Stalinisation. Most communist parties had more or less inertia in one way or another, but eventually they came to accept the secret speech and the terrible violations of quote-unquote socialist legality and all the rest of it. Well, it was quite true in the court, but that doesn't make terrible and all the rest of it. And revert effectively back to a pro-Soviet position, but with a new Soviet line. The PCF lagged behind radically on this, and only in 1961 actually came round to accepting this. Althusser was critical of this from the beginning. Not from a perspective that Stalinism was all-round excellent, and Stalin was a great leader of the workers' movement, or a great developer of Marxism, Leninism, even, quote-unquote. He opposed it on the basis that it's completely phony. He sees he's always complained. He always complains that the notion of the cult of personality being responsible for the failures and the distortions of Stalinism. He considers this, basically completely idealist. And the idea, and also he seizes on the phrase violations of socialist legality, as if the legal system just sort of floated in midair, and now that we sorted out the legal system, it's fine. He considers this phony, and actually, he considers that the new ideology, the paramount ideology of this of de-Stalinisation is humanism. It comes back almost from the dead. It comes back, and its main advocate within the PCF was a quite extraordinary man by the name of Roger Garodi, who had been one of the most, as is the way with such people, had been one of the most vitriolically pro-Stalin individuals in the PCF during Stalin was alive, and indeed a couple of years after he was dead. By the 60s, he had converted to Roman Catholicism, and his new philosophy was about about the great human tradition of man's struggle against to overcome his own alienation, and the Communist Party was going to be a part of this process, and by interacting with the Catholic Church and the Socialist Party, it would create the Great Coalition to get rid of human alienation. He was also an incredibly bureaucratically minded individual, as is the way with such people. He always quite alienated the party bureaucracy himself, actually, for a long time, because he was quite so far to the right of them. But eventually, as a kind of maneuver against people agitating for greater intellectual freedom, he was adopted as the party's official philosopher, and he used his control of various journals to silence his kind of positions opposed to his own. The battle between the two of them is kind of the key intellectual battle of the PCF in that era. It also has to be kind of pointed out that the PCF wasn't existing in a vacuum at this time either. Because of its massive dominance of left-wing politics, it wasn't quite as strong as it had been in the immediate post-war period, but it was still riding effectively off the back of the success of the French resistance and all the rest of it, and it still had overwhelming clout in the intellectual world and a lot of sort of peripheral. But this was already beginning to change. Within the academy, the big fashion, particularly as the 60s drew on, was structuralism. Structuralism came out of the theories of Swiss linguists much earlier, actually, in the kind of 1910s, who argued that if you're going to look at language, you have to look at it as a system. A cat, there's nothing about the word cat that means a little furry thing with a tail. It's actually entirely arbitrary. It only gets that meaning because it exists in a system of words, okay? And it only gets that meaning because it's different to every other word, effectively. It was also pointless to analyse, as linguists have been concerned with up to that point, language evolving through time. The way he described it was that it was like a chess game. You could start a chess game from any point. It didn't really matter how you got there. You could have a chessboard with the white pieces in some whatever place and the black pieces in whatever other place, and you could play the game of chess. It didn't matter where the pieces were before it. This was kind of quite obscure and mostly of concern to linguists until the 50s, really, with the appearance of one Claude Lévi-Strauss, an anthropologist. And he became incredibly influential. He effectively applied the theories of social. Well, he didn't so much apply them. He retooled them so they were useful to studying kind of mostly ancient social formations. And he basically he had the idea that underneath the kind of phenomenal differences in society, there was a sort of common deep structure. A sort of deep structure of myths, and even went as far as the arrangement of certain villages in Africa expressed the sort of deep structure of the human mind. What's curious about Lévi-Strauss, what has to be noted, is that at this time he still had to identify as a Marxist to kind of get anywhere. And there were others as well. There's a man called Roland Barthes, who became very influential in literary studies and also various related disciplines, who was actually, there's actually an argument there, you could say, that he was blending structuralism with Marxism by applying its sort of capitalist ideology, effectively. The thing is, Althusser is both kind of inspired by some of the stuff that's coming out of the structuralist movement, and also has certain more or less superficially similar concerns, with the kind of a shift from the essence of things themselves to how they interact with each other. But he also believes that structuralism is fundamentally flawed and unable to express these kind of relations in a meaningful way. So his project is both directed against the creeping influence of structuralism and also against a shift at the right in the PCS political line. The thing is that ultimately this was already visibly failing by the time we get to sort of 68. Actually, it's already visibly failing, and it's clear that he was unable to organise any real forces this way. And also the entire kind of problematic he constructs is very hard to sustain in the way that he tries to sustain it, i.e. with references to particular works of Marx and all the rest of it. He has to retreat, and the subsequent period of it is effectively self-criticising on various things. And the most famous bit to come out of the periods of self-criticism is a theory of ideology, which effectively he situates ideology as reproduction. It's a component of the reproduction of labour power. Okay, on the one hand, if you want to get people to come home to work the next day, on the one hand they have to be alive, so you have to feed them, you have to give them their basic necessities. However, you also have to reproduce them kind of ideologically. They still have to kind of have that fundamental level of their consciousness that they don't just not come in. So he says, therefore, that ideology happens at the level of reproduction. He also proposes a mechanism for how it happens, which is simply that by engaging in certain rituals, by engaging in activity, what happens is ideology effectively tailors you. It sort of enlists you in activity, and then it's in the activity that you become. On the one level, it's in the activity that you become able to act at all, but it's also pre-given that you can only exist in this way in ideology. You can only exist in this way by giving up a certain amount of yourself, effectively, by falsely identifying yourself as a subject, as a kind of discrete individual. This all actually comes from a psychoanalyst who's vastly complicated, Jacques Lacan, who had a theory that effectively, at some point in between the ages of 18 months and 2 years, a baby will catch sight of itself in a mirror, and only at that moment realise that it's separate from its mother, kind of thing. I mean, it's unclear to the extent to which Lacan literally means literally every child will see a mirror, because that seems a little bit hard to sustain. But he is an incredibly bizarre writer, in fact, and it's clear that more or less this is metaphorical of catching sight of another baby with its mother, or so there will be some formative experience which causes you to believe yourself to be a discrete and whole individual apart from the rest of the world. Althusser says this is ideology. Now, this has often been interpreted basically to mean that, well, that's it then. What's the point? We're already kind of shanghaied into being good capitalist subjects. We'll never get out of it. Ideology is subjective as all. But actually, the real political stakes of it is back to the Cultural Revolution. It's the idea that ideology is actually a site of contestation, because it can't involve direct repression. It means that it's actually far easier for ideologists, so to speak, purveyors of ideology of the working class, to get into positions of influence, for oppositional ideologies to be kind of produced. And this actually reflects a shift in his idea of the role of philosophy. Earlier on in his career, he basically believes that philosophy is the capital T theory of theory. So it's the ultimate background referent which decides how the different sciences interact with each other and all the rest of it. The thing is, it's obviously totally seals it off from the rest of the world. It's just this, on the one level, he criticises Gramsci for sort of making theory disappear into the ideology of the age, or the ideology of the class. But on the other hand, it seems that there has to be some kind of relationship. Otherwise, there would be no reason why it was a revolutionary communist Karl Marx who found historical materialism, and not, Carnegie, a steel magnate or some other individual. There has to be a link there. So now he decides that philosophy is effectively provides assistance to the class struggle. It's the class struggle in theory. It doesn't actually develop in any meaningful sense. The things that Althusser is arguing with Roger Parodi about are fundamentally no different to the things that Plato is arguing with Democritus about, or Spinoza was arguing with Leibniz about, or anything else. It doesn't change. Fundamentally, ideology has no history. He picks up this phrase from Marx and openly says that Marx meant something completely fucking different by it. What he means is that the entire history of philosophy is a history of idealism and materialism. Neither of them win. Materialism allows science to progress, idealism blocks science from progressing, and every so often one will get the upper hand and the other will get the upper hand, and but no one will ever win. It is necessary to keep on struggling, the permanent struggle, the cultural revolution. So this raises, this isn't the end of the evolution, isn't it? The end of the evolution is several bizarre texts, starting before he finally had his sort of terminal psychic crisis and strangled his wife in a psychotic episode. But the continuing after he becomes able to write again is that there's no order to the universe at all. That there's no kind of, that things happen because they have happened. And the job of philosophy is effectively to analyse what's happened and analyse what is happening, and then from there you can maybe act in the world in a meaningful way. But you cannot effectively, things just happen because of random encounters. Calls it aleatory materialism. Aleatory basically means random. So we have this big jumble, even basic on the level of theory, you have this big jumble of different theoretical positions. On the level of politics, we have basically a kind of crypto-Maoism, which is itself a jumble of positions which range from the most kind of vulgar Stalinism to an absolutely unshakable belief in the creative power of the masses. We have a jumble of we have positions which he claims haven't changed, and they have, and we have all this. And it has to be said that there's almost no philosopher in probably the entire history of philosophy, apart from maybe Leibniz, who presents quite such a problem for people trying to find out what he actually bloody thought, when he thought it, and what bloody use it is. So There's a moment in one of his books while he's still a sort of social democrat when the famous sort of literary critic Raymond Williams is outlining a big dispute between different schools of Marxism. I think it's something to do with base and superstructure, and he tests both sides. And then at the end of this little page, he says, "One who is not a Marxist will not try and solve this problem for them." So there's a very understandable temptation on the part of people who have not engaged with Althusser's philosophy to basically kind of go, well, what's the point? Leave them lot to sort of argue about it. The thing is, you don't get away with that. Because the theory of ideology, despite the fact that it's been cogently critiqued on point after point by people from all over the shop, nevertheless, it's a kind of revolution. It's the first truly convincing attempt to bring Freudian theories into an analysis of ideology. It's not the first attempt. It's not the Frankfurt School around Horkheimer and Adorno and Erich Fromm tried it before and come up with varying sorts of ways of doing it, but it's the first one that kind of really locates a mechanism for the production of ideology at the level of the unconscious. You just can't go around it. You cannot go back to the analysis of ideology from Marx's The German Ideology. It just, it's gone. The problem is raised in a whole new fashion. Althusser also fundamentally questions the interaction between Marxism and other intellectual projects. It raises the question of what the object of Marxism is. Whether it's Hillel Ticktin in an article a long time ago seemed to imply, maybe he can clarify it, that literally the only thing Marxism can produce knowledge about is political economy. He said that he used the example of Stalin saying the saxophone is a bourgeois instrument. How can there be a Marxist view? You'd end up saying things like that. The thing is, Marxism is fundamentally about the class struggle, and the class struggle does appear in music. It does appear in philosophy, in that either in that bleak, bizarre way that the late Althusser thought, or some other way. It appears all over the place, and wherever there's class struggle, presumably Marxists need to be. So it's another. The Althusserianism as a movement rather than the man himself actually raises it by the very proliferation of theorists and through all kinds of intellectual projects. If you can't go back before that either. You can't just sort of reject the last sort of 30 years of literary theory. Well, you could. We would mean. As far as historicism goes, I think largely he's at its most tenuous here in what he literally writes. There's a sort of gap from the sort of theoreticism, which is that theory is this kind of self-activating machine apart from history in the early part of history, and the idea that, and it seems there's that which is already sort of criticised, and the idea that there is literally kind of no development of philosophy through history. Also, at least you have to account for the changing forms in which the same question is raised over and over again at the very baseline level, surely, and that debate comes again. However, he is right that if science is an ideology, as Gramsci says it in those terms, science is an ideology, then the idea that you can have a scientific socialism is it's pointless. We're back to the beginning. Why, if Gramsci really believes this, I don't think he believed that for his entire career, but he did it at some point, then what's the point of being a Marxist? George Lukács, in a sort of in a kind of similar theory, expressed Marxism as a sort of world outlook of the proletariat. But you know, how does he know? Is if it's the world outlook of the proletariat, you know, it implies that he somehow wants some access to the outside of this world outlook, despite being a partisan of the proletariat and a partisan of Marxism, which is the world outlook of the proletariat. From what standpoint does he judge it? You don't have to believe that theory is a totally ahistorical beast to realise that somehow you have to account for the emergence of these things. As a conclusion, it's obvious that trying to weigh, on the basic level of Althusser's theory, you know, revolutionary practice as it actually appeared, it was a dismal failure. The PCF, despite his endless theoretical entreaties, refused to give up on revisionism, quote unquote, refused to stop drifting to the right, and indeed, the last real intervention he and his comrades do is at the 1978, I think it might be the 21st Congress of the PCF, or the 22nd, and they drop the dictatorship of the proletariat. Etienne Balibar writes a massive tract saying they shouldn't, they ignore it. That's the end, effectively. Then he kills his wife. So, on that level, it completely failed. But, still, there's simply no way of dealing with several key questions without going through them. And it seems to me that particularly a lot of the debate, such as it is, that appeared in the Weekly Worker over it, simply has taken the form of Leo Maroc patiently explaining this or that, and Bobby Smith kind of sticking his fingers in his ears and going kind of la 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 la, effectively. It's important to deal with them seriously, and I think if people do dig around it, they'll find a large amount to recommend it theoretically. Well, just on the factual level about trying to literary theory, I mean, it's easy to, you can pick up on Dühring and no one knows who the fuck he is. You can pick up on, okay, Leibniz partially no one knows who the fuck he is, but he does kind of have a sort of parallel struggle. But, you know, what about the Russian formalists? These are, you know, Bakhtin is still a major reference point for modern literary theorists. He had a revival, he's had another revival, another revival. I mean, look at all the sort of postmodern pragmatists looking at. Dewey, you know, it's not new stuff. It really isn't. It's almost quite a good demonstration of the sort of philosophy having no history thesis in a funny sort of a way. It has, if you scratch a postmodernist, you either find a kind of pragmatist or a sort of Saussurian lurking somewhere underneath. In terms of fetishism as a kind of theory of ideology in general, I mean, okay, it's certainly things do follow from the theory of fetishism which are identifiable as, you know, standard ideological effect. I don't think it's suitable as a general theory, because frankly, some very important bits of ideology do not follow from the commodity form. You know, does nationalism follow from the commodity form?
Is nationalism ideology?
What?
Is nationalism ideology?
Well,
is national, general national sentiment as opposed to...
Well, sorry, chauvinism. Whatever you like. I mean, I think it is fairly commonly considered an ideology. I mean, again, here we get into the discussion about what is an ideology in terms of a general theory, and we're kind of going in circles. But it seems to me that you have to account for it somewhere. You know, nationalism isn't a mode of production, it has to be something. What is it? You know, you could all argue it's as a kind of neutral fact about the world being divided into nation states or whatever, but you know, that's certainly it doesn't follow from commodity fetishism, and indeed, if you look in the lovely little glossary that comes at the back of Reading Capital, or even for Marx, it comes at the back of both of them. The only criticism of commodity fetishism offered is actually that some people have tried to make it a theory of everything in terms of ideology. They don't name Koch, but that's obviously who they're referring to. I think Lyndon's very much right in as much as we're talking indeed about a typical official communist intellectual, such a thing can be described it. I don't really think that kind of going on about how he's not selling the papers, therefore he's not a real party member, is actually, you know, really helpful, because the fact is parties set up their own divisions of Labour.
How many copies of this did Lenin sell?
Probably quite a lot.
For this quota?
Well, he may well have been out there. It may have been such that the division of Labour it could go either way. I don't actually know. But the fact is, you know, people do pick up jobs. We're not talking about a fabulous egalitarian party, remember. There are particular forms in which the division of Labour took. Right. In terms of the epistemological break, actually, in the terms of, there's a slight change in the terms it's posed. It's not that he changes his mind on it constantly. He changes his mind on exactly what proportion of what particular book of Marx is scientific and which bit is ideological. The fundamental thesis only changes in one major way, which is that in 1967, Althusser decides that there is no subject of scientific discourse. What this means is science it kind of works through people as a sort of animating spirit, but it isn't really done by individuals in that sense. So the epistemological break kind of happens. It doesn't matter in a sense that the Grundrisse turns up and Marx has gone back to Hegelianism. In fact, in the same period, Althusser very much changed his mind on Hegel, which I forgot to mention, and decides that effectively Marx sides with Hegel against Feuerbach on certain theoretical issues. The point with it is that I think actually, Chris, there isn't really a justice. He doesn't really think that the pre-1845 works are that useful. He actually, particularly after he changes his mind on Hegel, he begins to see them as actually a kind of aberration, sort of because they're under the influence of Feuerbach, who becomes a theoretical regression from Hegel. Whether or not, it certainly seems to be the case that with the break with Feuerbach, at least there is a change in the meaning of the kind of method. There is a, you know, he doesn't, when in 1857 he's writing the Grundrisse, he hasn't just read Feuerbach again, he's just read the logic again, the greater logic. So there is a change in the meaning of terms like alienation. They do reappear, but they reappear in a different form. And precisely the conflict with concepts like abstract labour changes them. Right. In terms of a theory of transition, no, it's not in Reading Capital. Well, actually, in a sense it is. Etienne Balibar attempts to cobble one together, but actually that's the most structuralist bit in the whole bloody lot, frankly. But there is a theory of revolution, and it's in full Marx. And he writes an essay called Contradiction Over Determination, and actually it does refer to real history. The bulk of it is an analysis of the Russian Revolution, which he describes in terms of a kind of build-up of contradictions, which become sort of condensed into a sort of ruptural unity, is the phrase he uses. And so even though, according to the sort of schema of great historical laws, Russia should be the last place the revolution breaks out, it was both the most backward and the most advanced country. It was the most backward in the sense that it had the smallest proletariat and still maintained the semi-feudal relationships in much of the country. And it was very advanced in the sense that it had the proletariat that was there was far more concentrated than anywhere else in the world. There's that famous factory whose name escapes me right now with Putinov works with 10,000 workers. In terms of testability, actually, again, this is a matter of sort of self-criticism and evolution of the thought. But I don't think it's going to suddenly cause a terrible crisis that makes him go mad, simply because in the reply to John Lewis, he proposes that that there is a criterion you can use to judge theoretical propositions, and that is they produce knowledge. And then he uses the example of a typical humanist sort of thesis, sort of told from John Lewis. Yeah, again, in this time. And compares it with his own Marxist-Leninist thesis, and he says that my one's better because it leads you to think about, it leads you to analyse the situation in terms of the classes involved, in terms of the different instances of the mode of production, blah 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 blah. It leads you to where stuff is. It doesn't lead you to think abstractly about the alienation of man, or man superseding his own history or some other thing. I'm not sure we really, I don't think there are very many theoretical positions in sort of Marxist philosophy at all, but I just want to kind of have a Popperite view of kind of falsification. Right, that. Jerry, Cliff Slaughter, farm to quote from E.B. Thompson, farm to quote from Althusser, saying, I don't care about politics. I'm not going to be very boring and find the exact moment in this precise book where he slags off John Lewis for not talking about politics, and goes on about how it's very important to talk about politics because in the last 3 years you've had the Great Cultural Revolution, we've had a massive, we've had 1968, no shame. And we've had the events in Czechoslovakia, blah blah blah. John Lewis doesn't talk about any of this. In 1972, a Marxist doesn't feel the need to talk about politics. And then, quote unquote, let him work that one out.
He wasn't talking about politics, he was doing politics.
What, John Lewis?
No, Althusser was ready to talk about politics, he just wasn't prepared to do politics.
Well, you can say that about an awful lot of people. That's just, again, as Lyndon said, that's a fairly standard thing for official communist intellectuals. It's in a sense, talking about politics. We're all doing politics in this room. Okay, we're not selling papers, but the fact is, this is an important part of being a Marxist. You do actually have to argue, not necessarily if we're talking about Althusser, we're talking about something. We have to orient ourselves. In fact, it's very SWP-esque, this idea that the actual activity is, going out and handing out leaflets. It's not. That actually plays into the hands of the division of that very negative division of labour between the swaps at the top and the blue-ass flies at the bottom. Okay, there was various points on sort of. something else. It's interesting actually looking at it, because there was a sort of struggle between the IS and the WRP over, you know, philosophy, because at that time, obviously, with the kind of background of kind of Jerry Gibby sort of turned to Hegel, obviously. Jerry Gibby turns to Hegel and Alex Kalinikos turns to Althusser, and it's sort of like a factional politics and sort of kind of ideological level. Oh, yeah, I didn't really deal with Jacques Lacan at all very well. He's not doesn't give you in a paragraph. I mean, the essay I refer to is the mirror stage in the process of Constitution of the Eye. Can't remember. Yes. And that was published in the mid-30s, but he was still writing at a furious pace, sort of in the 70s, and you can. It's quite strange. I mean, I don't think I think that Hegelian element is always there in Lacan, but in a very interesting form. I think actually that's one of the, when he's not busy trying to be a rock star, that's what Slavoj Žižek is very good on. He's very good at bringing out the Hegelian elements and actually situating the kind of more structuralist ideas of kind of chain of signifiers within the context of the sort of he's worth reading, but you know, Christ, if you think Althusser's a bit bloody, a bit of a slog. I mean, he is quite extraordinary. It's fine saying he's now. I mean, my point with literary criticism is a bad example because a lot of people just don't think there's any point. And indeed, Jodd says that Lukács retreats into literary criticism. In fact, he's doing it all along. I mean, as you acknowledge, the theory of the novel comes out in 1916. It's a concern of his from the beginning, and he continues to kind of nudge it all along. But he also continues to do the sort of high philosophy he does in History and Class Consciousness. I mean, Linden was telling me about some massive fat volume in the 50s on ontology. You know, he doesn't really change all that drastically, and they're all political states that you can draw out there. And there is also the other thing is there is a theory there. He has actually systematized the philosophy. There seems to be a kind of, I mean, Linden, you say that we must take what's useful. Well, that's fine, but if you're not trying to systematize, if you're not trying to pose a question of the relations of different theories, then you end up in this. You actually end up in a kind of homo eclecticism, really. You end up there, I mean, Frederick Jameson is the ultimate example of this. Frederick Jameson is a American literary critic, ostensibly a Marxist, and ostensibly a Lukácsian Marxist, who through his career has sort of harvested the bits and bobs from everything, absolutely everything. He did Sartre in the 50s and in the early 60s, then he did structuralism, then he nicked a bit of Althusserianism, then he nicked a bit of post-colonialism. It hasn't, I don't think it's really helped him in a funny sort of way. Actually, it's actually caused some disastrous errors, particularly that infamous essay in which he claims that all third world literature is national allegories, So, this is an example of a question that doesn't go away if you ignore it. We still have to deal with literature. You have to deal with fascism. I remember we found that Poulantzas book in the office about fascism, and there's things like this is good. It was useful, but if you're not systematizing it, then you're just going to end up with kind of the very strange sort of melange.
Never have pick and mix at
I have to say, when I get pick and mix, I go to this place called Bits in Plymouth, and the reason I go there is because they have candy sticks, and I just get a bag and I pour in the candy sticks. I'm a monomaniacal pick and mix. And I'm that nutty. You go.